Okay, good. So we're all interested in many of the same species, questions, issues. I want to try to present again, probably for many of you over again, a framework for thinking about sexual selection in a broader way. And I'm going to start with a non-mannequin, but one that's truly a challenge to evolutionary biology. This is this image of video taken by my former student now at Cornell at Scholes. I'll note that the eye is black. And of course, this is a polygynous lecking bird of paradise from New Guinea. And the female is about to come and visit the male and perch on his display log. You see, he goes through a now famous transformation, made famous by Ed in his research. Right? What we have here is a really complicated display. You've got that erect orb of feathers with structural color, super black feathers, which will be described to me. If you listen carefully, you can hear it snapping, making a mechanical sound with its wings, right? And of course, this it represents the extreme challenge sexual selection has before us, right? Why the hell? And of course, the issues go back for a century. Of course, this kind of complexity has had traditionally been explained, at least certainly in the recent decades, by two alternatives. One, or two broad alternatives, or I would like to frame it as two alternatives. One is that this animal is getting some kind of direct benefits or good genes by choosing this method. And the alternative is that it is, as I will frame, merely beautiful, right? That this is evolving like high fashion by a process, a natural process, but one that leads to not to adaptation, but to elaboration or aesthetic radiation. So this, I want to talk about normals, but I'm going to frame it first aesthetically by pointing out that this requires that the subjective experiences of animals, that quality of what it is like to be a bat, a mole, a more myriad fish, or a bird we're familiar with, to regard the world or to regard social signals in that world. And to realize that all of these studies are putting the subjective experience, that quality of actually having preference and exercising it, into the center of our science. Once we do realize that, we realize that there's a watershed in the area of studying evolution. And I'm going to start with a flower comparing, or plant, comparing the roots of a plant to the flower. We have a very good, elaborate set of theories describing the evolution of the plant roots, which interact with the physical material of the soil to keep the plant connected to the ground, to absorb water and nutrients, perhaps even interact with mycorrhizae, right? But if we ask something about the flower, we realize that major components of this flower function and are under selection because of their impact on the brain, the subjective experience of an animal, either an insect or a bird or other animal pollinator. And that this sensory cognitive function is necessarily more open-ended and in fundamentally distinct from the other. And so closer to home, we have an elaborate theory for the evolution of the beak of the finch, right, which cracks open seeds and has a mechanical function in the physical world. And yet the radiation and plumages of these cotingas in response to choice by females is of a different order. In the case of the beak of the finch, we can see that this kind of large seed-eating beaks have convergently evolved in over a dozen different bird families. Because if you don't have teeth and you're cracking open the seed, there's a finite number of ways to do that job. And so adaptation by natural selection in such a context in the physical world will result in convergent evolution of similar solutions across many species. And yet when we see sexual ornaments in birds or in many features, they have a greater radiation, a greater set of unique features, right? You pluck birds, they all look the same. You look at their feathers, they are suddenly different. And you listen to them the same. And so this is really the inspiration for why sexual ornament was recognized as a challenge to evolutionary biology, and is still an important thing for us to study. So there's this, as I say, watershed between natural selection on physical function and sexual selection, or natural selection and social selection, just on sensory and cognitive functions. So I'm really going to frame this as a field that we should be envisioning of aesthetic evolution. And that is the evolution of those features that have this quality of functioning in cognitive, subjective perception. And so what I'm going to propose is that this kind of evolution is an emergent property, emergent consequence of sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice. And when you have those three processes happening on a heritable substrate, whether it's cultural or genetic, then you will have the evolution of a component of the phenotype that is aesthetic, right? And I'll argue that embracing that language is actually a benefit to us. So part of the long picture is to bring beauty back into the sciences as a core of our mission. And in order to do that, I have to have a scientific definition, right? And I think this is, I think it's possible. Beauty is not merely attraction or desire. Beauty is a co-evolved attraction in which the objects of desire and the preference for it have co-evolved and shaped one another, right? And that interactive history is the property of being aesthetic, and when that's about attraction, then that's the property of being beautiful. And that allows us to actually approach these diversity of features, whether it's the sexual ornaments of cock of the rock or the wood thrush song, or the social features, social selected ornaments in a blue jay, baby bird cuteness of their mouths or features, or flowers as scientifically beautiful. Well, of course, this set of or this perspective is not new. It goes back to Darwin, and that's part of the mission, is to restore this aesthetic Darwinian perspective to our science. Of course, as we all know, Darwin, after he wrote The Descent of Man, had a number of persistent problems. He had no theory of genetics, no elaborated theory of human origins, and no theory of the evolution of what he called impracticable beauty. So when he wrote to Aesthe, soon after The Origin of the Species was published, he said, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." And if you look at that famous photo of Darwin, I think you'll agree, he looks a little sick, right? And he was kind of a sickly guy. And I think he would be what we would call today a somaticizer. He took his intellectual problems and turned them inward, right? And he had lots of periods of underproductivity and illness, and then brilliant productivity. In this case, instead of resting on his laurels on, without doubt, the most famous organic or biological scientist of the century, he wheeled around in a foxy way and created another hypothesis about how evolution could work, right? And that, of course, is what he described as sexual selection in The Descent of Man. And by the way, we're just 15 months away from celebrating the bicentennial, the 150th anniversary of The Descent of Man. So start planning on your campus what you're going to do to celebrate the 150th. Of course, he proposed sexual selection, which had both mating competition within a sex and mate choice among sexes. And actually, I'd love to talk someday about mating competition, male-male competition, or intra-sexual selection as an aesthetic process as well. So I want to emphasize before we go on that Darwin's description of the origin or of sexual selection by mate choice was explicitly aesthetic. So he used the language of beauty and art in his analysis. So he said, for example, he described mate choice as an aesthetic faculty, as standards of beauty, which you can read directly to the standards of beauties that pigeon fanciers used in breeding pigeons or chickens, right? And then he said, for example, the most refined beauty may serve as a sexual charm and for no other purpose. And here he elaborated that he explicitly stated that sexual selection was a distinct mechanism from natural selection. They could interact, but he was, quite clear that it was different. So when he says no other purpose, he means no other adaptive function, right? Of course, Darwin's view that male-male competition structured the natural world, indeed explained Victorian society to itself, made a lot of sense to people, so it was a big winner. But Darwin's idea that mate choice, explicitly female mate choice, was a force in nature, was a big loser. right? And it landed like lead boom, and it actually was, the rigid responses were, in many cases, blatantly misogynistic, and that's a long story I'll skip. But his main antagonist, his most effective antagonist, was Alfred Russel Wallace. And of course, this is the guy, the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection. So Wallace and Darwin fought about this for years. Darwin never gave an inch. Wallace lived. Darwin died in 1883. Wallace lived until basically until the opening of World War I, and had a really huge impact on what we think about sexual selection today. Now, many of Wallace's ideas were crackpot. He said, look how beautiful the peacock, if we open up the body, the viscera are all brilliantly colored, right? So the peacock is just the same thing on the outside, right? But that is actually, kind of like phrenology. Yeah, if you look at the bones of the head, you can understand the essence of the individual, right? And he was just saying the biological vigor of the organism will cause itself to be expressed in the phenotype in ways that can be perceived. Right? But when he was pushed to the limit to admit, like the peacock itself, that it didn't make sense, he said the following. Here it is. Wallace, in a section in a book called Natural Selection and Tropical Nature, he had a section called Natural Selection, Neutralizing Sexual Selection. The only way in which we can account for the observed facts is by supposing that color and ornament are strictly correlated with health, vigor, and general fitness to survive. Now that's fascinating because Wallace is generally credited with being the guy who killed sexual selection for a whole century. Bob Triggers and Ernst Mayr in 1971 were the guys who basically revived it, supposedly, right? And here is Wallace basically describing the idea of adaptive mate choice, that the idea that mate choice provides some kind of indication about quality, right? So this is the inherently Wallacean idea. Well, what do you do with that? Well, it turns out that his victory over sexual selection was rhetorical. Here he says, unless there is the strictest correlation between ornament and general perfection of the more brightly colored or ornamented plumage, what if there is, between such a correlation, then sexual selection for color or ornament, for which there is little or no evidence, becomes needless, because natural selection, which is the admitted rare causa, will produce all the results. So here he is articulating the main mechanism that most people believe is sexual selection, and here he is saying, but I'm just going to call it natural selection. Well, this is the death of natural selection, right? Well, what was he eliminating? What he was eliminating was the possibility of something other than an adaptive kind of mate choice, because Darwin's hypothesis was exclusively adaptive. As I said, Darwin and Wallace fought about this for the rest of Darwin's life, and then 6 years later, Wallace wrote a book called Darwinism, in which he's basically initiating this perspective as Darwin as the source of this science. And he says in the introduction, even in rejecting that phase of sexual selection depending on female choice, I insist upon the greater efficacy of natural selection. This is preeminently the Darwinian doctrine, and therefore I claim for my book the position of being the advocate of pure Darwinism. Here Darwin's been dead for 6 years, and Wallace is already claiming to be more Darwinian than Darwin, right? And it's 150 years soon, and I'm still pissed about this. And I hope that you will be too, because you have been denied an actual understanding of Darwin's true views on it. So all this neo-Darwinism, adamant support of adaptation by natural selection as the sole or singular or important locus of natural selection is Wallacean. It's not Darwinian in the slightest. And here's the act. His fingers are all over it, right? So what happened, I think, is that Wallace lost the credit, I think appropriately, for the origin of the idea of natural selection. But he won the war over what evolutionary biology would become in the 20th century, which is an idea dominated by the insistence on the greater efficacy of natural selection. And it's that insistence which is still, I think, relevant to lots of behavioral biology done today. So I could go on about that history, but I'm going to skip ahead to a proposal of a way of an alternative of a null model, a way of addressing the difference between the Wallacean and the Darwinian. And so what I think the modern version of Darwin's idea of aesthetic evolution as potentially independent and potentially interacting with natural selection is best described as by the Manakin-Kirkpatrick mechanism of sexual selection, which goes back to the early 80s, and which I'm proposing and have proposed for nearly 10 years as a null model for this process. So what is the null model of? It's a null model of the evolution of traits and preferences. And we'll maybe return to that if we have time. So what does this show? Well, I just want to go through it a little bit so you remember what's involved. This is basically drawn from Landy and later papers by Kirkpatrick. But here we have the genotypes plotted with each individual carrying genes for mating preference and for display trait. And all of these are males or females, and we've all got genes for each, but they are expressing in most, or in polygyny species, just one. What you see is if we start with a random display, or a random distribution around some intermediate value, that lots of these individuals who say like long tails are going to find mates with who have them. Right? So there'll be a lot of mates in this quadrant. Likewise, individuals who like mates with short tails or bluer traits or whatever the dimensions are will mate here. But there'll be few mates here and here. As a result, you will evolve a genetic covariance between genes for traits and genes for preference. And we know when the traits covary, like genes for long legs and long arms, or short legs and short arms, that selection on one will create selection on the other, right? So if you select on dogs to have long hind legs, you don't end up with a kangaroo, you end up with an Irish wolfhound. And likewise, short legs, you end up with a dachshund, you don't end up with a whale, right? And so as a result, that's because those genes are correlated. And so when females choose on their display traits, they are indirectly also selecting on other traits. Now this is not an exotic assumption. This is the actual definition of what preference genes are. You can't avoid it. And any theory of good genes or direct benefits, in order to demonstrate that it's effective, has to prevent this process from happening in order to have those models. Right? We go back to the theory of all the good genes, etc. They had to engineer this out of the system, right? In order to demonstrate that that was sufficient on its own to create preference evolution. Right? So what happens next? Well, the next stage is to imagine at the population level. Right? So here we have mean preference. This is now a population mean of preference and display. And going back to Fisher and also codified by Kirkpatrick, there's three things we should imagine. Well, the first is that the best thing for a male to be is exactly what most females like. So, and you might even think understanding male display is simple, or males in general. Right? So that's this sexual selection optimum, which is going to be the one-to-one line. Also, we can obviously, going back to Darwin recognized clearly that there were costs to sexual selection, that there would be a natural selection optimum, perhaps at some intermediate display. See, these guys have tails that are too long, they can't fly, or they get eaten by hawks, and these guys can't fly. So what Landy and Kirkpatrick realized that Fisher did not, is that there should be an equilibrium between the sexual advantage and the survival advantage. Individuals down here survive beautifully, but they're not sexy enough to get mates. Individuals up here are perfectly sexy, but are unlikely to live long enough to benefit. Right? And so you have that line. What's interesting about that line is that all values of display are possible. Right? So this is not going to shut down diversity, but actually open it up. What happens, how would you evolve toward the equilibrium? And this gives rise to these totally wacky diagrams, going back to Landy, where you have covariance between the two displays, leads to the fact that you cannot evolve directly to the line. You have to evolve along the direction of the covariation, right? This is where the genetic variation is available, and depending on it and the amount, you will evolve. And what that means is if you're disrupted from the line in one direction, you'll elaborate or return to the line by making the trait smaller or larger, depending on that thing. And under exotic genetic conditions, it can even be unstable, leading to what Fisher called a runaway. So that's the core of it. The last thing I want to say is that this little population covariation is imaginable as a single point in this display. You want to see here, right? So, of course, this Landy-Kirkpatrick null model, I'm proud to say, has plenty of citations. but there's almost nobody that cited it for the Null model. It's always, if you want to say, oh, but Fisher, you cite this paper. But the number of people who actually applied it in a piece of work is very small. Like, I don't know, maybe 0. So I'm having marketing problems. So that's why all this is turned. So I've turned to a new marketing strategy, which I'm talking about the lady competitor. I'm talking about beauty happens, right? And then what I mean is when there is a choice, when there's a sensory perception, cognitive evaluation choice, then beauty will evolve, right? And you have to get in the way of it. You have to shut it down or make it happen. One, I want to point out just a couple things about the Null model. One thing is that the Null model does predict costs. The existence of costs are not evidence of honesty, right? The difference, the deviation between the natural selection optimum and the sexual optimum is the cost. And it's always there, except basically there. So unlike the predictions of the idea of a hobby, there are costs, and the difference between or the prediction of things of how to test a hobby is even more detailed. Now, where does adaptive make choice come in? Well, imagine another dimension of natural selection on female preference, right? So what that would mean is another point for some reason, perhaps sensory perception in the environment, or perhaps good genes or parasites are associated with a certain resistance, associated with a certain color or certain behavior. That would give rise to another equilibrium line, which would shut down this equilibrium to a single point. And this gives rise to an obvious result, which Darwin understood, which is that if natural selection is equivalent to sexual selection, then the patterns of diversity in traits that are sexually selected should look like the patterns of traits that are subject to natural selection, right? Like the beaks of the finch, the colors and the songs and the plumages should be equivalently variable to those things that are under natural selection. Of course, they're not, right? So we have a different open-ended problem, and it goes right down to here. Now, for those of you who want to take this home and describe to your friends or your family or your loved ones, what did he say? You can just talk about this. I'm going to compare to identify the difference between Wallace and Darwin. I'm going to compare the value of beauty to the value of money. Now, under the gold standard, a dollar had value because every dollar stood in lieu of a tiny piece of gold from Fort Knox, right? The value is not in the dollar, it's in the gold. The value is extrinsic, outside of the dollar, right? But now, on the planet, every single, some of the older members of the group, within our lifetime, every single currency on the planet has abandoned the gold standard from dollars to Bitcoin, right? And there is no gold. So where does the value of the dollar come from? Well, it's, as Paul Samuelson said in the 50s, a social contrivance. And Fisher, all that stuff I just covered, is the details of how it's contrived, socially contrived in a genetic sense, right? So in this case, under the aesthetic one, the value of the dollar is in the dollar. So what does it have to do with biology? Well, the honest adversement hypothesis about direct or indirect benefits, the value of beauty is in the gold. It's in something else. It's in what is correlated with trait variation, right? But in the fully aesthetic or Darwinian mode, the beauty is a social contrivance. There's no gold. Where does the value come from? It's in the beauty itself. It's in the direct benefit of, or the indirect benefit of choosing. And that's obviously that females that choose, males that are attractive will have offspring that are also attractive, leading to more offspring, right? So to fully drive it home, I'm going to compare the beauty of the peacock's tail to a rainbow, right? And indeed, we ask ourselves, is the beauty of the rainbow just the rainbow? Or is it an extraneous bit of it? In fact, we have a whole cultural idea around the idea that the beauty of the rainbow is actually in the pot of gold at the end, right? So I put the good genes in that pot, right? And so the question is every ornament in nature like a rainbow leading to a pot of gold? And it's our mission as scientists to discover that gold, right? Well, I maintain that the burden of proof is on the adaptive idea. If a leprechaun comes up to you and says, oh, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, You say, show me the money, right? But indeed, if you actually try to publish a paper today and say, this is an arbitrary trait, you cannot do it until you've proven that the pot of gold ain't there. Well, you know what? That is impossible to do, right? And that is why we need a null model. Because if you don't have a null model, right, then you are becoming like this fellow here. And I hope to put the leprechaun hat on the Ross there to reinforce that. Now, there have been other evolutionary sciences where we've had this null model debate in genetics. It took, with neutral theory, it took 20, 30 years for these debates to be run, and the null models won having one. In community assembly and community ecology, it was the same thing. There was a very strong adaptationist, competition-based hypothesis to structure the world, and you know what? You need a null model. And we're in the same situation, and that's where we have to head, I think. So to compare the two worldviews, we have the Wallacean and the Darwinian. Wallacean, we have a belief in the singular powerful nature of adaptation, and in Darwin's perspective, multiple interacting evolutionary mechanisms. In Wallace's world, sexual selection is a form of natural selection. In Darwin's world, they are distinct mechanisms. Wallace, in many ways, I'm not going to talk about duck sex, but explains away the agency of individuals on adaptation. And Darwin recognizes the agency of individuals, the actual subjective experiences, as the cause of the important. In the adaptive world, synthesis and reduction are considered fundamental scientific values. And here, pluralism and recognition of emergent processes are fundamental scientific values. Right? Now, I'm inferring something right here about the definition of sexual selection. I didn't make it clear, but I think the Darwinian view of sexual selection requires that we separate this. And you realize that this has been baked into our language. The difficulty with thinking of selection as potentially different mechanisms. So, for example, to Darwin, fitness meant physical fitness, right? Like the ability of a phenotype to accomplish an act in the world that would further its survival of fecundity, right? But then in the population genetic 20th century, fitness became associated with genes, right? And fitness was redefined in the early 20th century as an abstract genetic concept, right? The relative representation of your genes in terms of degradation, right? That confounds the independent contributions of survival, fecundity, and mating and fertilization success, right? So these were different mechanisms of evolution to Darwin, but they have all been put into the word fitness. And yet fitness has kept, although it's an entirely different concept, right? They kept the same romantic association with adaptation by natural selection, even though they combined things that Darwin thought were explicitly not adaptive. So this modern definition of fitness actually prevents us from conceiving of the world in a generally Darwinian way. And that's why, I don't use the word anymore. Because you can't use it and I think be, in this sense, accurate about the world. So that's why I would bust it out. Now, this does not mean that any of your favorite adaptive mate choice hypotheses cannot be pursued, but they're pursued as interactions of these two, right? And that's totally cool. But this is a world that's safe for aesthetic research or Darwinian research. So what does an aesthetic evolution research program look like? Well, we would define sexual selection as distinct evolutionary mechanisms. Adaptive mate choice occurs through the interaction of them. Aesthetic evolution actually, as I've defined at the beginning, actually includes all honest advertisement and or direct benefits through genes and an arbitrary or officiating process. It's all about beauty. Even a Rolex and a Maserati are both beautiful, even though they function really well, right? That's still beauty, right? Beauty happens as the null mechanism. Our responsibility is to reject it before we embrace an adaptive explanation. And I think evolutionary biology will benefit if we embrace the aesthetic agency of animals and put them at the center of our science. Now, I'm running out of time. I just want to, everybody knows this example, but I'm just going to give, maybe later I'll refer to it. I just want to say it's not a Swiss Army knife. Yes, what do you mean by that? Hold on. Okay, so back to the birds. This, of course, is Macropterus deliciosus, bloodwing manakin. And at this point in my talks, I usually say, and it's singing with its wings, and everybody goes, ah, but of course that's no surprise to this audience, right? I first saw this displayed in 1985 in El Placer, on the west slope of Ecuador. It's a species of endemic to the Chocó, western Ecuador, cloud forest in Colombia. You can see from the date up there, it took Kim Bostwick and I 20 years to figure what happened. Actually, Kim was in elementary school, so she had to, or maybe kindergarten, she had to go to school, and ended up in my lab all these years later, and then it took us a while to punch through. But of course, Kim was among the very first generation to use high-speed video in the field, and work on showing that the feathers are oscillating over the back. Right? Now, the sound is at 1,400 hertz. The wing oscillations are about 100 hertz. That means the sound is 14 times faster than the movement of the feathers, right? So they can't be going click, 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 click. There's got to be some other, way to get those feathers dry. And these are amazing movements, 100 cycles per second, little muscles keeping that, or at least rocker action there. And then here are the club wing feathers, right? And what Kim finally convinced me of was the hypothesis that had rejected in 1985, and that was stridulation. That this fifth secondary is bent over and rubbing against the bumps on the sixth secondary as those feathers oscillate back and forth. You see, as they go in, this feather's moving down and up and down and up, and that's produced. That motion is creating a mechanical stimulus of the sixth secondary, which causes it to vibrate at the frequency of the sound, which Kim in subsequent work has shown has an intrinsic vibration rate at 1,500, 1,400 cycles per second. Now, in subsequent work, Kim has shown something really beautiful, which is that beauty is not only skin deep. In order to make the sounds that females are attracted to, have really transformed the musculature and wing bones of the manakin. And in this case, we're going to focus on the ulna. And here are ulnas of other closely related manakins, Pippa and Dizyphia. And this is the ulna of the male. And you can see that it's huge and solid, and it has a calcium density that's orders of magnitude greater than the close relatives. This is the weirdest ulna in Aves, or at least the weirdest flying ulna in Aves, right? And so somehow Kim's work really blew me away, and I immediately started thinking about, what about the females? Well, it took us a really long time to get our hands on it. It turns out there was not a single skeletal specimen of Macropterus deliciosus in any museum in the world. So, if you think we've already got enough collections, this is one area, right? This doesn't exist. So we had to extract them informatically with CAT scans of skins that had the ulna preserved. So there's a Dizyphia or a superba male. There's a male club wing, and here's a female. Now, her ulnas are not solid like the male, but they are huge, ridiculously huge. And we measured a bunch of ulnas. This is, I think, 180 species. We had almost all 169. We have all the species that we had almost for, males and females, or mostly males and females from our phylogeny. And so this is where Macropterus is. It's 3 standard deviations among among all the away from the mean in robustness, the width versus the length. And the only bird we found that was robust was flightless penguins. So what is going on? Well, I call this the evolution of decadence. Evolution of decadence. What's happening here is that females are selecting on males for this extraordinary wing advertisement, right? But they have also transformed their own wing bones in ways that must affect their capacity to fly, or some other bird would have. Now, in the old days, phylogeneticists used to argue that stasis meant that nothing was happening. It was the adaptationist position coming out of Kern Reeve and Paul Sherman was, oh no, that means if you have stasis, that means that natural selection has maintained that for a reason. So characters being canalized or restricted is a result of adaptive mate choice or adaptive natural selection to limit variation. So the fact that females have these, even though we haven't had them flying in aviaries with grid paper behind them, they certainly are having very weird bones, right? So I think how would this work? Well, the fact is that wing bones develop in the embryo before the embryo becomes either male or female. And so what that means is that there's no possible genetic variation to make the wing bones a different shape than the male and not have them, and then the female, until some kind of sexual dimorphism kicks in, which is well after hatching. So that means that females have chosen the males they like, and as a result, they're getting sons that sing beautiful, sexy songs that are attractive to other males, or attractive to the females. But their female offspring are also inheriting these bones and are made worse. The fact is, what shuts down the Fisher process or an arbitrary process is natural selection on preference, but it's happening on your daughters, not on you. And so if the advantage of having sexually attractive male offspring is greater than the disadvantage of having daughters that fly less well, there's nothing that can stop this from going to extinction. Right? And we've got this manuscript that's still working on it, and Sam Snow has done some math, so I think we have a demonstration that Kirkpatrick and Landy both did similar models back in the 80s. So how common is decadence? Well, I think it's everywhere. For example, if here's some species that have the same phenomenon, where it's about the embryo. So here is a bird of paradise, Wilson's bird of paradise. Barney just saw it like last month. Yeah. Okay. So the male has this beautiful turquoise crown with these beautiful black, super black feathers crisscrossing it. The female has the same thing, but in dark blue. Right. Now, what's going on there? Well, the follicles that grow the feathers are laid down in the embryo, beginning at day 8, before the embryo was either male or female. So by the female selecting on the male to get that beautiful head, she becomes bald as well. Now, her little blue head is one way to kind of cover that thing up, but it certainly can't help her avoid predators as she sits solitarily on her open nest, right? Well, there's got to be a cost there. Now, another similar thing in cock levain, the way you get a central crest is not by having feathers that twist, by reorienting the feather follicles 90 degrees along the central midline so that they grow into that mohawk, right? And that means, again, it has to happen in the embryo before, and there's a female with that same little mohawk, right? And so if you look at female Mastus chrysopteris or umbrella birds, they have or Antilophia, they've got the little feathers coming over the nose, same phenomenon. And so those are clearly decadent. And then here's cases, we see other cases where it's actually not about embryogenesis, but just generally development. Here's a female Pipperfelicata that has tail feathers, although not black pigmented, that are of equal or almost equal length to the male, right? So I think this kind of decadence is probably likely everywhere. Actually, it featured a lot in Darwin and Wallace's debate, that they were very confused about what genes cause sexual differentiation. And so that was very unproductive. So what's the role of decadence? I think there are special circumstances in which you can demonstrate the existence of an arbitrary process. There is no adaptive mate choice mechanism that allows for the female to getting worse, right? And indirectly, or their daughters getting worse, right? And so if this is not costly, well, then there's nothing to reinforce its honesty either, which means it's also arbitrary. So I hope that. I think examples of decadence are like checkmate in the chess game over whether or not sexual selection can be arbitrary. And there are no currently recognized examples of Fisher process, but I think this is absolutely one. Okay, so this view begets a kind of understanding of aesthetic agency of animals that's led to a lot of work on sexual conflict in duck sex. It's led to the last part of the book is really about about the evolution of humans from an aesthetic and sexual conflict perspective. If we had discussion questions, that we would have had time for those. You can go to the book. 11 translations. Ainda não temos publicação, edição em português, mas estamos tratando. If you like something more formal, you got the publications, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thanks.